Okay, now I'd like to talk just a little bit about two men, Shubal Stearns and Daniel Marshall. And the story of those men, which would in time become brothers-in-law and be co-workers, co-laborers that moved, converted in New England and became Baptists, both affected by the preaching of George Whitefield, and would move Marshall first to Virginia, followed by Stearns, and then together down to central North Carolina to form the Sandy Creek Baptist Church, and that church becoming a missionary hub that would send missionaries and start local churches all over the South. These two men and their distinctive personalities, their distinctive traits. Daniel Marshall was known far less as a fiery preacher, more of a thoughtful person, quieter, and Shubal Stearns as the Baptist George Whitefield, really, and their tireless effort to push out into what at that time would have been very much the wilderness and true mission fields down in this area. A lot of work among the Native Americans, the Indians, which at the time many people considered to have no soul, to be just animals and not worthy or not necessary to evangelize them because of the fact they couldn't be saved anyway. They didn't have souls. To take that missionary work, and for both of them to do it when they were much older in life than what we would normally think. Daniel Marshall beginning his work at the age of 45, in making these big moves, moves as a family. So anyway, I summarized a little bit about the new lights and the old lights and how that Whitefield and his preaching saw these men converted and desired to be fully biblical or New Testament in their beliefs. When word got back to Whitefield that his preaching was turning Congregationalists, Church of England people into Baptists, his quote was this: "My chickens have turned to ducks." True, in the period of the Great Awakening proper, Baptist churches in Massachusetts grew from 6 to 30, in Connecticut from 4 to 12, in Rhode Island from 11 to 36, and other churches were established in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And so Whitefield was pressed by these men who became Baptists about his belief and his practice of infant baptism and his association with the Church of England. He held to that all the way to his death. He would not let go of those his church association nor of his belief, practice, and baptism, although his fruit was far more Baptist than it was Anglican. Shubal Stearns, born in Boston, January 28, 1706. As a young man, he moved to Connecticut with his parents and joined Congregational Church. And in George Whitefield's tour of Connecticut in 1745, Shubal Stearns would have been 39 years old at this time. He is converted. He's converted, and his church where he was at entered into the Pedo-Baptist, anti-Pedo-Baptist controversy by 1751. And at that year, so Shubal Stearns there would have been age 45, became a Baptist and started a Baptist church in the same town where he was at Tolland there. Changed that church in 1751, 45 years old. Daniel Marshall was born in 1706, same age as Stearns, and he was saved in 1726. He was a deacon of the church there in Windsor, and he was married in 1742. Daniel Marshall and his wife had a son, Daniel, but Daniel Marshall's wife soon afterwards died. It's at that time in 1747 Daniel Marshall married a gem, Martha Stearns. This is Shubal Stearns' sister, and she was known as a woman of stalwart character, and she was a driven, committed, sold-out, separatist, fiery woman. And so now the Marshall and Stearns family became a force in the early history here of Baptists in colonial America. Daniel Marshall, in the church of which he was a deacon before he became separated from the Baptists, they said he became odious to the Orthodox Church by preaching Baptist doctrines. And the church took it out on Daniel Marshall. He served as a deacon in this church for 20 years. And his wife died, as we said. And as the people assembled to witness the funeral ceremony, the pastor of the church, under whom Daniel Marshall served as a deacon, refused to perform the usual funeral service, upon which the people dispersed, leaving Daniel Marshall, the widower, to bury his deceased spouse by himself. Well, certainly that caused the final break for Daniel Marshall, and he became a separate Baptist. And again, Marshall, already saved, but became deeply affected by George Whitefield's preaching on his 1745 preaching tour, the one in which Shubal Stearns was converted and saved. So we move ahead. 1751, Stearns and Marshall both had become strict separate Baptists, and they were faced criticism and social ostracism for their preaching. That didn't stop them. Daniel Marshall got really burdened about the fact that the Lord was soon coming. He got really energized about the fact that he had better use the time that he had left in life. Now, of course, life expectancy today is much longer than it was back then. So a man 45 probably was looking at not too many more years left on this earth. And it was the case, Shubal Stearns lived to age 65, so he didn't have that much longer. So he got really burdened, and he just committed the rest of his life to God. And so he started off by Daniel Marshall leaving Connecticut and moving to East Central New York, and working there among the Indian population of that area in a rough, difficult mission field. Of course, go back to colonial America, you got the French and Indian War, which Indian tribes are on which side. Safety was very much a concern and an issue back in these days. Both countries, England, France, trying to buy off and persuade the Indians, different tribes to side with them. And so Marshall spent some time there in New York, and Shubal Stearns got the same missionary zeal that Marshall got, and felt that the Lord had work for him on the western frontier. In time, by 1754, both of the men found themselves together in Hampshire County, Virginia, where they established homes and church services held in those homes and outdoors. There were Baptist churches in the area at this time called regular Baptist churches. These would have been a little bit more Calvinistic, and they would have been started by the Philadelphia Baptist Association, another group of preachers who we'll talk about later as well. But these regular Baptist churches did not mesh well with Shubal, Stearns, and Daniel Marshall. The regular Baptist churches were quite formal. Shubal, Stearns, and Daniel Marshall were quite not. And Martha Stearns was very much quite not. They contrasted it like this. Regulars, dignified and orderly in their worship service. The separates, under Marshall and Stearns, occasionally noisy and emotional preaching. So they were there for a brief time. At 1755, a year later, Shubal Stearns receives a letter from North Carolina. There were some friends that had gone down there, and they said, our state is destitute of spiritual influence. Would you pray about coming down here? They said, if we do have a service, people will travel from 40 miles away through the rugged terrain in order to hear one sermon. Well, Stearns and Marshall, seeing the Baptists somewhat established there in Virginia, they made their way in the summer of 1755. I believe it's either 11 people or 11 couples made the trip. Again, they've moved from Connecticut down to Virginia, now Virginia down to central North Carolina, in the area known as Sandy Creek in what is now Randolph County, central North Carolina. Well, long trip, weary, footsore. Again, they set about to build houses and gather food before the cold weather set in, and they needed to build a meeting house. As soon as they arrived, they built them a meeting house, says one historian. And the 11 people were there. And Stearns was understood to be the minister. He was a natural leader. He was a matchless preacher. And as the church was very small, they did a unique thing. They recognized Stearns to be the pastor, but they established Daniel Marshall and another man named Joseph Breed as assistant pastors. Very small congregation to have two assistant pastors. But the reason they did that is because they had a plan in mind. They had big plans. They planned to expect great things from God, and they planned to attempt great things for God. And so for them, 3 pastors was no big deal. Stearns began to preach, and he preached very simply a simple gospel. And they said that his gospel message was understood by the rudest of the frontiersmen in North Carolina. People were coming from neighboring farms to hear the first preaching. Many of them had heard in months, some in years. And they said they'd never heard preaching like Shubal Stearns preaching before. They couldn't decide what they loved more, the content of his messages or the delivery of them. Both were powerful. And many of the area would have called themselves Christians, but what they did not hear and what was new to them was the new birth. Same message George Whitefield preached, but he preached it with such vigor that these Christians realized they needed to be born again to be Christians in the biblical sense of the word. So, his preaching, warm and appealing, full of persuasive zeal, not like the lecture-type discourses which the people had formerly heard. North Carolina was getting filled up with immigrants, people coming into this area. 20 to 30,000 people living in this part of the state had arrived within the past 10 years. So these are new transplants to the state, and they were met with this zealous preaching that was going on. The work of Stearns, specialist in church government and discipline. He had a high view of the Baptist church, and he encouraged every one of his members to be active in the life of the church. He said everyone had a word to say, or a prayer, or an exhortation. Someone that was converted was immediately put with someone else, and together they would go witnessing. He wanted the new converts witnessing for Christ immediately. So they were put together with a new converts, put together with those that had been saved. And out they went to witness. Women prayed and spoke freely in public. In other words, the women were evangelizers and spoke openly about their faith as well. Daniel Marshall, together here with Stearns. We talked about Stearns' voice and his leadership. Daniel Marshall was characterized as a weak man, a stammerer, and no scholar, but had tireless enthusiasm for the gospel, and his diligence never waned in his entire life. Here's a quote. Stearns' preaching was prophetic and personal, but its characteristic quality was most notable. The preacher evidenced complete dependence upon the Holy Spirit, and his hearers knew this. Within 1 year of establishing the church at Sandy Creek, the effort to evangelize the area was implemented. They wanted to go east and head all the way down to the coast in North Carolina and test what could happen if they went on this trip. And they did, and they preached, and Daniel Marshall pushed northward into Virginia, southern Virginia. Others pushed south into Georgia, South Carolina, establishing churches. And in 1758, the Sandy Creek Church Association was established. Now the new little congregations that were being started would gather together once a year at the Sandy Creek Association, be encouraged and exhorted to follow on. And so the church needed these three pastors because often one or two of them would be gone preaching and evangelizing. So the response, of course, is wonderful among the people, but it was challenged by the church elite. A Reverend Michael Smith set about to curb the efforts of an enthusiastic sect which call themselves Anabaptists, and these Anabaptists are daily increasing in my parish. The separate Baptists were undermining the Anglican church when they convinced the members of that church that baptism of unconverted children was unscriptural. And it was throwing on its head this church life. They pointed out, too, how often does your church baptize an adult convert? Stearns and Marshall would ask. But people were realizing, well, next to never. Next to never is that the only church growth is through birth. And they're not out seeing anyone converted. So that truth got these Anglican preachers to say that the Baptists were bewitching their people. And In fact, in 1764, George Whitefield stopped in eastern North Carolina and spoke against the rebaptism of adults and in favor of baptism of infants. And that gave the established churches a little bit of say against that. I mentioned about the fact that Stearns started to see his church membership often depart and go to mission fields. And some would say that he would have grown lonely because after just about 5 years, not many of the original group that came with him were left at the church. They were out other places. But he was too busy to remain nostalgic or lonely, and he grew older. But his pace never stopped. He got invitations to come to Virginia, to South Carolina to preach, and he went every possible time that he could. Power of God was present wherever Shubal Stearns went. In time, the Sandy Creek Association was so large it had to be divided into 3 different because of the distance. Their mission had expanded so far out, and so the distance for these different churches to come to the association was so far, they divided it into 3 areas. 1771, November 20th, 1771, the Reverend Old Father Shubal Stearns died at the age of 65. His mission to the South was only 16 years long. He was the chief light behind the separate Baptist movement. 42 churches, 125 preachers had sprung up from the Sandy Creek Church within those 16 years. 42 churches, 125 ministers. Shubal Stearns, Daniel Marshall.